Hi, welcome to the Rittner Floral School in Boston, Mass. I'm Dr. Steve Rittner, and it's a pleasure to welcome you into one of our classrooms today. We've got a very, very neat class planned for you. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Today's subject is we're going to be playing with some tropical flowers, some exotic flowers, and we're going to make a big vase arrangement. And I think you're going to find that the approach will be interesting and the results will be very, very showy. First of all, we start with our container. On every floral design, generally we start with a base of some sort. I've got a fairly good-sized bowl here, and I've got 2 blocks of foam that are in the bowl. Now, in order to get them up to this height, I've taken some foam scraps that we have in a foam scrap bucket, and I packed it in pretty much tightly onto this base, and then I put my 2 blocks of foam right on top of it. They're in here very, very tightly. They're not going anywhere. If you feel a desire or a need to put some of the florist tape across in this direction or in this direction, you certainly can as an added precaution. But I find that generally when I jam it in fairly tightly, it's pretty good and it's ready to go. We're going to be playing with a variety of different things in today's class, and I think that you'll enjoy the selection because this is stuff that normally here in the Northeast we don't see every day, and we like to play with it when we can. We've got some heliconia. Aren't these amazing? Absolutely beautiful. Whenever I get an opportunity to play with these, I am just thrilled because they are so pretty, and they're big, and they're showy, and they have quite a presence. So I'm going to start off with our heliconia on our design, and in order to come up with our shaping, I'm going to start with this particular kind of flower, and I'm going to place one in the center back of the design. And you can see with one flower, it makes a statement. It definitely makes a statement. It's big, it's showy, it says, here I am. And that's the beauty of these kinds of flowers. You can come up with some really, really cool results very, very quickly. Now, I'm sure, my viewer, you don't expect me to make a floral design just with one flower. So I'm going to take a second one. And I'm placing my second one just a little bit in front of the first one. So I have a second of my heliconia. And then I'm also going to continue to work forward on my design. In other words, I'm not just going to go with 2 of my heliconia. I'm actually going to go with 3 of them, and I'm going to place a third right over here. I think you can see, my viewer, that with just a few of these, they make a statement. And the fact that I'm putting them in such a way that this one, and this one gradually coming forward, but all congregated together, it really gives quite an interesting impact to our design. Now, I'm going to mix this with some other materials. There is another kind of flower. This is called a Psittacorum heliconia, Psittacorum. It is also pretty striking. It's a smaller one, but it's really, really bright and it's bold, and it gives us some really, really pretty colors to play with. And I'm going to start playing with some of my Psittacorum heliconia, and as you'll bear with me, my viewer, while I start doing a little bit of cutting, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to place it over here, slightly to one side of my first heliconia. So I'm taking this and I'm going to gradually work it in. Notice, my viewer, I'm taking one flower at a time and playing with it. By doing it that way, I can control this and come up with a very, very interesting result. I'm going to take a second heliconia, and I'm going to place it a little bit lower, coming over right at this side here. I'm going to continue my process, my viewer. I'm taking some of my heliconia and working them in. My next heliconia, my Psittacorum, I'm going to work right over here. As I said, this is kind of a thrill for me because I don't get to play with these tropicals all that often. So whenever I do get a chance to play with them, it's really fun. I'm going to take another one of my heliconia, and it almost feels a shame because I'm gradually cutting them down lower and lower, and I'm moving that one slightly to one side. Notice, my viewer, that as I'm placing them, I have this one facing in this direction, this one over here, this one over here, this one over here, so that they're facing slightly different directions. That's going to give me, I think, more interesting effect than having them totally like soldiers on parade. I'm going to take another one and I'm going to really, really come out long. In other words, notice this one is coming out way over to one side. So I've got some interesting things going on with my heliconia in the center, my pseudocorum working here, here, over here, here, and down over here towards this side. Now at this point, obviously this design is kind of balancing over towards this side. I'm going to come up with a counterbalance on the other side. In order to come up with my counterbalance, I'm going to take one of my favorite materials. This is a monstera leaf, and they're big, they're bold, they're showy. And you'll notice, my viewer, I can take a monstera leaf, work it over onto the other side here, and notice how this is going to help balance it off. Now let me just angle this just a little bit more so that you guys can see it. And you can see that that's definitely giving us a counterbalance here to what's going on over there. Now let's see, what other mischief can we get into? I have a flower that is kind of pretty flower. This is a ginger. Again, we're playing with tropicals here. So I'm going to play with my ginger flower, and I am going to work with it. Generally, when we get ginger, we get them in our markets here in the Boston area, either in red or sometimes in pink. And so I'm going to work some of my ginger over here, placing one over here in between my two pseudocorum heliconia. And I'm also going to work one, I'd say, slightly over towards the back. I'm going to cut this and work it right over here so that it's kind of propelled over back towards that side. And then I'm going to take another one, and I'm just grabbing these off of my design bench, my viewer, while I'm talking with you, and I'm cutting them down. And my next one is going to go right about here. So notice that we've got some very, very interesting things going on. It's a gradual process of building these things up. I like to think of it one step at a time in terms of how we're handling this. Now, there are other things that we can do on this kind of design that are also interesting and are kind of fun. For example, I have on my design bench, along with my various kinds of heliconia and my ginger, I have some palm leaves. Now, there are all kinds of things we can do with palm leaves. We can take palm leaves and come up with all kinds of shapes. And the thing that I like about palm leaves is that we can literally cut them into different kinds of shapes and different kinds of patterns. And one of the things that I do recommend, my viewer, is that you play with this and see what works well for you. Like I'm trying one on one side, on this one, I'm doing it in little segments here. On the other side, I'm doing it as a general curve. We can do all kinds of things with these. So I'm going to take some of my palm leaves that I cut prior to doing this demo. I figured I'd cut a few up and then just have them on hand. Let's take one and place it right over here. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm making use of the palm leaves in a structural kind of manner. I am not using them so much to cover mechanics, but rather as a way of coming up with structure. They're operating almost like individual flowers, if you want to kind of think of it that way. I've got another one over here. I've got another one which I'm going to cut down, and I'm going to use a little bit closer right over in here. So in other words, we can play with some of this in terms of doing our design. Now, what other mischief can we get into here on this arrangement? Oh, yes, I have some other kinds of foliage here. Sometimes when we're doing these designs, we can use things like aspidistra leaves and tie leaves to come up with interesting effects. Now, we could do a similar thing. We could cut these down if we wanted to, but one of my favorite things that I like to do is to simply take leaves like this and then bend them over like so. And when I bend them over, I can tie them with some 23 or 24 wire and use them in terms of loops worked into my design. It's a cool way of coming up with an effect. It's quick, it's easy, and it's fun to do. So I'm going to take a couple of my leaves that I have literally just bent over and tied with my 23 or 24 wire, and I'm going to place one right here because I've left a little spot open for it, so I might as well sneak it in here. And then I'm going to take a second one of these, and I'm going to work it in a little bit closer. So I have 2 of my foliage loops in here that are creating another interesting pattern in this design. In other words, you don't try to do this, then this, then this, and then try to do it different things in sequence. You take one thing at a time and you play with it. And if you do that, you can come up with some really, really interesting results on your design. Now let's see, what other stuff do we have that we can play with? Well, I do have some of another one of my favorite flowers, and you guys know just about every botanical at this point you know is one of my favorite flowers, but I have some sunflowers. And to my way of thinking, sunflowers are probably one of the happiest flowers out there. It's a very optimistic flower. It's bright, it's cheerful, it's sunny. It just makes you feel good. And there's no reason why we can't mix non-exotic materials together when we're doing these things. I know you probably have heard people say, well, you can never mix tropicals and non-tropicals. You only have to use tropicals together. We've always advocated that tropicals are great, and we could continue to fill in with more of our tropicals on this. But in my belief, they're far more interesting when you play them off of other materials, things that would include sunflowers, things that would include everyday flowers that we see around typically on the design bench. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to start with some sunflowers, and I'm going to work a few sunflowers into our composition. And I think you'll see that when we start playing with some of these, it really gets interesting because we're playing with different colors, different textures, different shapes. And so I've got a sunflower up there. I'm going to take another one of my sunflowers, and I'm going to cut it down a little bit closer, and I'm going to work this one right over here so that I am playing with these different colors and these different shapes and working them in. And I think that it gives a really, really interesting effect to our design. Let's work another one in, and this next one that I'm going to work in, I'm going to work it smack dab down here as a focal area this flower. So you can see that's coming out very, very interestingly. Now, we can do the same kind of thing with other flowers. Here's another one of my favorite flowers. I happen to love it. It's available pretty much year-round. It is a pretty flower. It is a standby in our industry, our Fuji. Fujis are available pretty much through the year. We can get our Fujis in white, we can get them in yellow, we can get them in kind of a pinky lavender. I like the mint green, and I think the mint green work very, very well. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to play with a few of our Fujis in this design. So I'm going to do just that. And once again, I'm going to take them and work them into the arrangement. And I'm going to cut a couple of my Fujis down and work them in. I think that there's a good spot right about here where we could work a Fuji in. That's kind of interesting, in between right there. And, you know, we could also probably fit another Fuji in a little bit lower, kind of not quite as low as our sunflower here, but there's a nice spot right in there. So I am going to work a Fuji into this spot right here. And then let's see, where else could I work one in? I'm just adjusting this. Oh, yeah, sure. Why not? I can take another Fuji. I see a little spot over here that looks interesting. So I'm going to take another Fuji, and I'm going to work it in so that it fits right into this spot here, so that we have a little area in between my pseudocorum and my ginger that is covered. That's, I think, interesting. And now let's see, what else can we do here? We've been using our sunflowers. We've got some of our Fujis in here. There's one other thing that I see here. I see a little spot over here. I think that I'm going to work a Fuji right into that spot too, because I have plenty on my design bench, and that sometimes you will work it out as you go along in terms of if you see a spot that you think could use something, you'll work it in. And I'm going to work another Fuji right over here because I think it will work really, really well. Now, I could stop about this point if I wanted to, but wait, there's more. I have a flower that you're going to laugh when I show it to you. It happens to be one of my favorite flowers, and don't laugh, even though you may think you're going to laugh, carnations. Why not? Carnations are one of the best values in flowers out there. They're a workhorse flower. They're available throughout the year. They are reasonably priced. You can't kill the darn things. They are very, very hardy, and they come in a rainbow of colors. In my opinion, this should be part of your everyday palette. Mix them in with other things. You can come up with some great results. They fill space very, very well. And so what I'm going to do, my viewer, is I'm going to work a few carnations into our mix. I'm going to work one. I have a spot right over here. I'm going to work a carnation right in here. And let's see, what else do I have? I'm just looking in terms of my arrangements and the various carnations that I have available. I have another spot right here. We could work one right in here. That would work nicely. And let's see, what else do we have? Oh, I see a spot right over on the side where one of these might work very nicely. I'm just going to make a little cut on this, and I'm going to work one right over onto this side here. So we've got an interesting curve coming across with our carnations. That's kind of interesting. It's pretty. Now, there's one other thing that I notice, my viewer. As I've been doing this, I've been cutting some of the stems down. And I'm left with, very often, things like this, pieces. And there's no reason at all why we can't make use of some of these pieces in our design. In other words, these are basically stems that have been cut down, discarded, and so forth. In the old days, we would have thrown these out. But nowadays, these work really well in terms of our designing. We can use them to attract attention, to create an interesting effect on our design in terms of the various parts of it. It almost feels like it really belongs there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few of these and I'm going to work them in because they add added dimension, added depth to our design. You'll notice how this is coming very, very interesting. And this is stuff that at one time would have been discarded. In my opinion, don't discard it. It works well. It adds interest to our arrangement. It's very natural. Looks really, really cool. So I'm working a few of these into our arrangement. Let's see, do I have any more of these pieces floating around? Because if I do, I certainly can make use of them. And yes, I do see one here. So I'm going to take this and trim it down just a little bit and then work this one in. Just bear with me, my viewers. I'm taking one and I'm adjusting it. And I think this one would work really, really nicely. Oh, about in this spot here. So I'm going to work this one in right here. So you can see, my viewer, it's making our design far more visually complex. It's an interesting kind of mix as far as this is concerned. Now, any of you who know me know that Dr. Steve generally loves branchy stuff. I love branchy stuff because I think it makes our designing far more interesting. And I do have some curly willow here. So I'm going to work some of my curly willow into the design, into the mixture. And curly willow or any kind of branchy stuff can be used very, very effectively in our designing. It makes the design bigger. It adds interesting curves. It makes it feel very, very different than it otherwise would. I'm not going to use a huge amount on this. I'm just taking a little piece or two here and there, and it adds texture to our arrangement. It makes our arrangement feel a little bit wilder because all of our other flowers are pretty straight in terms of the stems. They're rigid. But when we start adding some of our branchy stuff that's a little bit more curvy, I think you can see, my viewer, how the branchy stuff is definitely going to add a different kind of feel to our arrangement simply because it's got these kind of wild pieces going every which way. So I'm going to work a little of that over here as well. And it doesn't take much, but you notice, my viewer, how this design is becoming a little bit more complex because of the use of our curly willow. And it does definitely give us some contrast with the more rigid stems that we're playing with here. This one doesn't want to stay for me. Here, let me cut this down just a little bit more. And then this one goes in there. And I think you can see we've got something that's very festive looking, very, very interesting, very, very pretty. I'm surveying the design to see if there's anything else that I would like to do on it. I think that it looks pretty darn good. I think the only thing I might want to do is shift this flower just slightly over and add one more of my sunflowers to the mix, because I definitely have it and I have the space in order to do it. So I'm going to work one more over here because I don't think one was quite enough for that area. Now I've got something coming down around here with my sunflowers. I've got something starting up here and curving around with my Fujis. I've got a nice curve that's working here with my carnations. We've got something nice going with the foliage here, a little segment with our ginger, and the pseudocorum coming over here, coming down around here over to this side. The major heliconia that we started with in the center, the monstera over there, it looks just great. There's one more thing we have to do, and that is cover our mechanics. And to cover our mechanics, I'm going to use some of my moss. Prior to using my moss, I am going to take some number 20 wire. I'm going to make what we call hairpins. In other words, I'm bending the 20 wire over my pair of clippers to come up with little upside down U's. I am going to cut these, being very careful to cut far away from my hand. And so I'm going to cut a couple of these right here. And I think you can see, my viewer, that I end up with these little pieces of metal. But now what I can do is I can take some of my sheet moss and then I can place it in here, on here, around here. And then if I want to make sure it stays, I can use my hairpins, poke it right in, and that will hold it in place for me. I'm going to take another piece, place it over here. I tend to be of the drippy droopy approach on this stuff. I like to let it drip and droop over the edge. Some designers like to tuck it in very, very neatly. But it is important that you always cover your mechanics. And some of these pieces could be just simply placed in between some of the stems as we're doing this. But I think that for anything that's on the edge, you definitely need to add a hairpin or two. Now, if this design is being used for serious use, I would do the sides and I would also go around the back on this. However, I think, my viewer, you can get the idea in terms of what's going on here. So what do you think, my viewer? We have a very big design. This design is not teeny tiny. It is a very large design. It is a very, very prestigious design. These things do not come inexpensively. There's lots of really, really nice stuff in here. But I think you can see we've got some nice use of negative space. It definitely feels like there's very, very good value in this. This design could be used in a bay window. It could be used in a reception area. It could be used in an entry hall. It could be used in a hotel lobby if they want this kind of styling. In other words, it's got all kinds of great possibilities. My viewer, I thank you for coming in. On behalf of all of us here at Rittner's Floral School, it was a pleasure to present this lesson to you. Go out, grab some heliconia in various varieties. If you can't get heliconia, you could try bird of paradise. You could mix with other kinds of exotics like protea, anthurium. In other words, play with some of your exotics, but don't be afraid to mix them in with some of your other materials like sunflowers, carnations, Fujis, things like that, because you'll find you can come up with great results. And don't be afraid to work in some branchy stuff. Branchy stuff definitely adds a lot to it. And when you start mixing some of these things together, I think you, my viewer, will find you can come up with some very, very neat designs. On behalf of all of us here at Rittner's Floral School, I'm Dr. Steve Rittner. We thank you for coming in and visiting our school today.